Hi, I'm Aris Reyes at ngayon po, we will talk about the new contents of the licensure examination for criminologists under sa new curriculum po. Narinig nyo na ba ang Professional Regulatory Board of Criminology Resolution No. 05 Series 2022? Ang resolution po na ito is all about the adoption and promulgation of the revised table of specification for the subjects in the licensure examination for criminologists. Ito po ay isang guide at malaking tulong sa mga magte-take po ng Criminology Board Examination dahil nag-set po ang ating Professional Regulatory Board for Criminology ng mga specific topic na ilalabas po sa Criminologist Licensure Examination. At kung kayo po ay magpupokus dito, kayo po ay papasa o maaaring maging top-notcher sa exam na ito. Kaya i-share nyo po ang video ito sa mga kakilala nyong criminology students or magte-take po ng Criminologist Licensure Examination para matulungan po natin sila. Itong Board Resolution No. 5 Series 2022 ay nagawa po noong April 12, 2022 at ang kanyang date of effectivity ay noong May 14, 2022. Sinasabi po sa loob ng Board Resolution 05 na ang ginawang new table of specifications po ay i-apply po sa December 2022 Licensure Examination for Criminologists. Sa new curriculum ng criminology, meron pa rin tayong 6 areas at na-revise na din ang kanilang weights or percentage sa licensure examination for criminologists under the Professional Regulatory Board for Criminology Board Resolution 01 Series of 2021. Ang area ng criminal law, jurisprudence, and procedure ay nag-remain pa rin po sa 20%. Ang law enforcement administration ay naging 15% na po, dati po itong 20%. Ang criminalistics or forensic science na kung tawagin ay naging 15% na din po, dati po itong 20%. Ang crime detection and investigation ay tumaas po sa 20%, dati po itong 15%. Ang criminal sociology or criminology na ngayon kung tawagin ay tumaas po sa 20%. Dati po itong 15%. Ang correctional administration ay nag-remain pa rin po sa dating 10%. And take note, all areas po ng criminologist licensure examination ay may kanya-kanyang 100 items questions. Ano-ano nga ba ang mga specific topics under sa new table of specifications? Mauuna po nating tatalakayin ang criminal law and jurisprudence. And this area is composed of 6 subjects. The first subject is the introduction to criminal justice system. Out of 20% po na percentage ng criminal law and jurisprudence sa CLE, 1% po ang manggagaling sa subject na ito. And that 1% is equivalent to 5 questions. 2 questions po ang manggagaling sa functions ng law enforcement agencies in arrest, detention, human rights, investigation, etc. 1 question from the process of filing criminal cases from police to court and the rights of the accused and victim. 1 question from the interplay and rules of the components of the Philippine criminal justice system, and 1 question from the other modes of criminal justice system, etc. po. Ang second subject po natin ay ang human rights education at 1% din po ito or equivalent to 5 questions ang manggagaling sa subject na ito. 2 questions from the Bill of Rights and other rights granted by the Constitution, 2 questions from the statutory rights of the accused and victims, rights of arrested person, etc. po, 1 questions from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, children, women, prisoners, state actors, and non-state actors. Ang pangatlong subject po natin ay ang Criminal Law, Book 1 of the Revised Penal Code. Pangalawang pinakamahalagang subject po ito dahil 4% po ito or equivalent of 20 questions. 3 questions ang manggagaling from the fundamental of criminal law, characteristics, principles, etc. 7 questions from the classes of felonies, stages of commission, who are liable, who are not, classification of the degree of participation in the crime, 2 questions from the classification of penalties, duration, effects, and extinguishment of liability, and 8 questions from the circumstances affecting criminal liability. Ang next subject po ay ang Criminal Law RPC Book 2. This is the most important subject because 35 questions po ang manggagaling dito. 12 questions from the elements and principles of crimes against national security, fundamental law of the state, crimes against public order, crimes against personal liberty and security. 17 questions from the crimes against person, property, chastity, civil status, honor, and quasi-offenses. 6 questions under the following: special penal laws but not limited to firearms, human trafficking, carnapping, anti-terrorism, etc. The another subject of the criminal law and jurisprudence ay ang evidence po. This is 3.4% and equivalent of 17 questions po ito. 8 questions from the classes, types, kinds of evidence, rules of admissibility, burden of proofs, and presumptions. 8 questions from the procedure in the presentation of evidence, weight and sufficiency of evidence. 1 question from the DNA evidence, rule or electronic evidence, child witness. And now, we have the last subject, which is the criminal procedure and court testimony. This is 3.60% or equivalent to 18 questions. 8 questions from the principles of jurisdiction, classes, types, kinds of courts, and the prosecution of offenses, preliminary investigation, trial, and judgment. 8 questions from the procedures in arrest, bail, rights of the accused, motion to quash, search and seizure, and provisional remedies. 2 questions from the rights of witnesses, qualification and competence of witness, or legal obligation and responsibilities and legal abilities of witness. Let's proceed to the next area, which is the crime detection and investigation, or CDI. And this area is composed of 9 subjects. The first subject is the fundamentals of criminal investigation and intelligence. This is 2% of CDI or equivalent to 10 questions. 3 questions from the principles of criminal investigation, like tools of investigation, attitude or characteristics of crime or criminal investigators, kinds and techniques of investigation, intent and motive, etc. 4 questions from the different modes, methods, types, techniques of gathering, collection, preservation, and processing of information, etc. 3 questions from the principles, procedures, legal requirements, methods, and techniques of the following: arrest, raid, search, check and choke points, crime scene processing, confession and admission, etc. The next subject under this area is the specialized crime investigation 1 with legal medicine, and this is 2% with 15 items question. 5 questions about crime scene search for each crime falling under the crime against persons of the revised penal code and relevant special penal laws. 6 questions about the following: types and classification of open and closed wounds, changes in the body of the dead person, other related and relevant forms of injury, etc. 4 questions from the evidence, testimony, and documents required to prepare and process in the filing of cases for each specific crime falling under the crime against person under the revised penal code and relevant special penal laws. Next subject is the specialized crime investigation 2 with interview and interrogation. 10 questions din po ang manggagaling ito. Yung 3 questions is about sa crime scene search for each crime falling under the crime against property of the RPC and relevant special penal laws. 4 questions about the evidence, testimony, and documents required to prepare and process the filing of cases for each specific crime falling under the crimes against property of the RPC and relevant special penal laws. 3 questions about the interview, interrogation, symptoms of guilt, etc. The next subject is the traffic management and accident investigation with driving. 10 questions din po ang manggagaling dito. 2 questions from the legal provisions of the following: registration and renewal of motor vehicles, driver's license, and renewal, traffic signs, traffic lights, and other control devices, pavement markings, right-of-way rule, etc. 3 questions from the pillars of traffic law enforcement, pillars of traffic management, pillars of traffic administration, early warning devices, etc. 4 questions from the processes of traffic accident investigation, hit and run collision and non-collision type of accident, chain of events in an accident, etc. We have also the subject of the fire protection and arson investigation. 3% po ito and equivalent to 15 questions. 3 questions from the concept of combustion, 3 questions from the classifications, causes, prevention, and extinguishment of fire. 2 questions from the organization and mandates of the Bureau of Fire Protection. 3 questions from the revised Fire Code of the Philippines of 2008 or the RA 9514 and its IIR, and the Law on Destructive Arson and relevant provisions of the Building Codes of the Philippines. 4 questions from the techniques and procedure in fire and arson investigation and processing of arson evidence and filing of charges in court. Next subject is device and drug education and control. 10 questions din po ang manggagaling sa subject na ito. 2 questions about devices such as but not limited to smoking, drinking, alcoholic liquor, gambling, prostitution, and other vices. 4 questions about the procedures and or legal provisions of the drug operations by PNP, PDEA, NBI, and Customs, etc. 4 questions from the salient provisions of the Dangerous Drugs Law, other relevant and related laws and rules, etc. We have also the subject of Technical English 1, Legal 4, at 10 questions po ito sa CDI area. 7 questions from the different legal forms like affidavit of arresting officer or witness, complaint affidavit, application for search warrant, etc. 3 questions from the parts of an affidavit, legal responsibilities, obligations, and liabilities of making or executing affidavits, etc. The next subject is Technical English 2, Investigative Report Writing. At meron din po itong 10 questions. 7 questions involving the reports used by the PNP, BGMP, BFP, PDEA, etc. 3 questions involving grammar and composition, radio codes and phonetics, reports or memorandum, etc. Now, ang last subject po ng CDI ay ang Introduction to Cybercrime and Environmental Laws. At 10 questions ang manggagaling na naman po dito. 5 questions from the cybercrime offenses, cyber intelligence or investigation, digital evidence, etc. 5 questions from the Solid Waste Management Law, Toxic Substance Law, Clean Air or Water Act, etc. Now, we have the third area of the Criminology Licensure Examination. As I've said a while ago, this is 20% na po, and this is composed of 7 subjects. The first subject is the Introduction to Criminology. 3% po ito at merong 15 questions. 5 questions from the basic theories of classical and positivist. 3 questions from the fundamental concepts of law, crime, criminology, criminal justice, etc. 3 questions from the typologies of crimes, delinquents, and criminal offenders. 2 questions from the concepts of punishment, sentencing, and rehabilitation, etc. 2 questions from the Philippine Criminology Profession and Career Path versus Criminologists in other countries. Mayroon din po tayong subject ng Theories of Crime Causation dito at 3% po ito or equivalent to 15 questions of the Criminology area. 2 questions from the fundamentals of crime causation with emphasis on biological, psychological, etc. 2 questions from the biological and psychological theories of crime causation. 5 questions from the sociological and economic theories. 4 questions from the biopsychosocial theories. 2 questions from the theories on female offenders. We have also the subject of human behavior and victimology. This is 3% at 15 questions din po ito sa ating area. 2 questions from the concepts, theories, and evolution of human development. 5 questions from the typologies of human behavior, criminal, and personality disorder. 4 questions from the legal consequences of behavior issues and responses to offenders suffering from mental disorder. And 4 questions from the nature and concept of victimology and victimization, etc. Ang fourth subject po natin dito ay ang professional conduct and ethical standards. 2% po ito at 10 questions ang manggagaling sa subject na ito. 2 questions ang manggagaling sa philosophy of ethics, morality, values, social norms, and standards. 3 questions from the PRC Oath of Philippine Registered Criminologist Code of Professional Conduct and Ethical Standards. 3 questions from the Oath of Office for Public Officers and Employees or the RA 6713. 1 question from the Law Enforcement Code of Professional Conduct and Ethical Standards. 1 questions from the Human and Public Relations. Ang next subject po natin ay ang Juvenile Delinquency and Juvenile Justice. This is 3% at meron po itong 15 questions. 3 questions from the nature and theories of juvenile delinquency. 3 questions from the parental rights and responsibility and disciplinary authority over their children. 2 questions from the rights, welfare, and protection of children. 1 question from the juvenile delinquency prevention programs. 1 questions from the models of juvenile justice system. 2 questions from the provisions of RA 9344 as amended, UN declarations, etc. Ang next subject po natin ay ang dispute resolution and crisis or incident management. 2% po ito at merong 10 questions. 2 questions from the principles of negotiation, arbitration, mediation and conciliation, etc. 3 questions from the restorative justice and retributive justice, etc. 1 questions from the principles of police critical and incident management. 1 questions from the RA 9285 or Alternative Dispute Resolution Act of 2004, etc. And 2 questions about critical incident management and 1 question about the various types of crisis, disaster management, and assessment. Now, we have the 7th subject of this area, which is the Criminological Research 1 and 2. 4% po ito at merong 20 questions. 5 questions from the types, kinds, and classification of research and methodologies, etc. 6 questions from the rules adopted in writing technical papers under the APA or American Psychological Association, etc. 2 questions from the do's and don'ts of the ethical issues in research writing. 2 questions from the rules in developing problem and data collection. And 5 questions from the research design, research framework, statement of the problem, hypothesis, etc. And now, we have the 4th area of the CLE, which is the Law Enforcement Administration area. And this is 15% po ng CLE at meron po itong 6 subjects. Ang first subject po natin ay ang Law Enforcement Organization and Administration Interagency Approach, and 3% po ito and equivalent to 20 questions. 7 questions ang manggagaling sa Principles of Organization, Management, and Administration. 6 questions from the Organization of Law Enforcement and Public Safety Agencies under the Executive Order 292, etc. 7 questions from the powers, functions, and organizational structures of various law enforcement and public safety agencies. We have also the subject of comparative models in policing. 3% po ito at equivalent to 20 questions. 4 questions from the theories of comparative policing. 6 questions from the models of policing. 6 questions from the multicultural policing. 4 questions from the Philippine Policing Extradition Treaty and International Agreement on Law Enforcement Operation. Ang next subject po natin ay ang Introduction to Industrial Security Concept. 3% po ito at merong 20 questions. 5 questions from the theories, concepts, and philosophy of security and safety. 7 questions from the related laws in security and detective agency operations, etc. 8 questions from the basic industrial security concepts, etc. Ang fourth subject po natin ay ang Law Enforcement Operation and Planning with Crime Mapping. 3% pa rin po ito at 20 questions. 5 questions ang manggagaling sa principles and elements of planning, types of plans, etc. 5 questions from the constitutional and statutory rights of persons affected by law enforcement operation. 5 questions from the police operations, BFP operations, PCG operation, and etc. 5 questions about the crime mapping, etc. Next is we have also the subject of CFLM, the leadership, decision making, management, and administration. 2% po ito at merong 15 questions. 6 questions from the theories, characteristics, and principles of leadership, etc. 6 questions about the police administration or management, etc. 3 questions about the problem solving and decision making factors, etc. Ang next subject po natin ay ang CFLM 2, Character Formation, Nationalism, and Patriotism. 1% po ito at 5 questions po ang manggagaling dito. 1 questions from the nationalism and patriotism, etc. 1 questions from Filipino character, values, and cultures, etc. 1 questions about the values of Filipino heritage or Filipino language, etc. 1 questions from the relevant provisions of 1987 Philippine Constitution like Preamble, Article 2, Article 3, etc. 1 questions from the relevant provisions of RA 8491 or the Flag and Heraldic Code of the Philippines. Now, we have also the forensic science area, and this area is 15% of CLE and it is composed of 6 subjects. The first one is the personal identification techniques, which is 2.70%, equivalent of 18 questions. 2 questions from basic principles of personal identification. 4 questions about the application of dactyloscopy, etc. 4 questions about the techniques in detection, collection, preservation of forensic evidence relative to friction ridges, etc. 4 questions about the forensic tools or equipment and systematic methods in processing latent prints, etc. 4 questions from the examination, identification, and presentation of evidence, etc. Under this area, we have also the subject of forensic photography, which is 2.55%, equivalent to 17 questions. 2 questions from the principles of photography, 4 questions from the types of photography in their application to law enforcement operations, 2 questions about the analog and digital photography, etc. 5 questions about the photographic exhibit, and 4 questions about the legal aspects of photographic evidence, etc. We have also forensic chemistry and toxicology, which is 1.80%, equivalent to 12 questions. 3 questions from the principles of forensic chemistry and toxicology in relation to crime detection and investigation. 2 questions about the accepted protocols for handling chemical and biological evidence from crime scene to the courtroom. 3 questions about the standardized tests and appropriate laboratory equipment in processing biological evidence and physical evidence. 2 questions from the scientific procedures in the recognition, collection, and preservation of drugs, poisons, and other toxicological concerns. And 2 questions from the case reports and factual reports in support of a court trial. Next subject is the question documents, which is 2.55%, equivalent to 17 questions. 2 questions from the scientific principles of identification and examination of standards and question documents. 3 questions from the protocol in the selection and examination of standards and question documents, and 4 questions about the techniques in restoring and deciphering erasures and obliterations in the handwriting, signature, and other question documents. 4 questions about the different equipment in question document examination, etc. And 4 questions about the document examination reports, etc. Now, the 5th subject is the lie detection techniques, which is 2.51%, equivalent to 17 questions. 3 questions from the scientific principle and the theory of psychophysiology to lie detection, etc. 3 questions about the use of polygraph and other various lie detection techniques, etc. 4 questions about the indication of truth and deception using polygraph machine, etc. 3 questions about the polygraphic questions, etc. And 4 questions about the examination, interpretation of polygraphic evidence, etc. Our last subject under this forensic science area is the forensic ballistics, which is 2.85%, equivalent to 19 questions. 2 questions about the scientific foundation and principles of firearms identification, etc. 2 questions about the type of firearms, etc. 4 questions about the types of ammunitions, etc. 5 questions about the class and individual characteristics of firearm, and 4 questions about the laboratory equipment and tools used in examination of ballistic exhibits, etc. and 2 questions about the nature and characteristics of low and high explosives. Now, ang pinakalas area po natin ng CLE ay yung Correctional Administration. Ang Correctional Administration area ngayon ay may 3 subject na po. The first subject is the institutional correction, which is 4% or composed of 40 questions. 8 questions from the theories and principles of penology, punishment, penalty, etc. 11 questions about the functions, organization, etc. of BJMP, Bucor, provincial jail, and other facilities. 11 questions about the person deprived of liberty, etc. in BJMP, Bucor, provincial jail, and other facilities. And 10 questions about the principles, management, etc. in BJMP, Bucor, provincial jail, and other facilities. We have also the subject of non-institutional correction, which is 4% or equivalent of 40 questions also. 13 questions about the probation system, etc. 11 questions about the parole system, etc. 10 questions about the executive clemency, etc. And 9 questions about the provisions of the law on PDLs, preventive imprisonment, good conduct time allowance, etc. The last subject of this area is the therapeutic modalities, which is 3% or equivalent to 20 questions. 6 questions comes from the rehabilitation and reformation programs of BJMP, provincial jail, Bucor, and other similar facilities. 5 questions about the reintegration programs of the person deprived of liberties of BJMP, provincial jail, Bucor, and other similar facilities. 8 questions about the rehabilitation programs, reintegration programs, and promotion of human rights programs among the person deprived of liberties across all institutions. Yan po ang table of specifications na magiging content ng ating December 2022 and onwards licensure examination for criminologists. Pero mas maganda po kung basahin nyo po itong mga resolution ng buo para mas maintindihan nyo po ang mga ito. Kaya nilagay ko na po ang mga links sa mga resolution na yan sa description area below. Pakiclick na lang po ang mga links at automatic na makikita nyo po ang mga yan sa download area ng Chrome apps po ninyo. At kung may natutunan po kayo sa video ito, just hit the like and subscribe button at pakiclick na rin po ang notification bell para ma-update po kayo sa susunod kong video, especially sa mga new curriculum subjects ng criminology. Kita-kits po sa aking susunod na video.